Hello there, fellow explorer. Episode 6 of the Vintage Pilot School podcast, which is designed around the basic premise of Thomas a Silly Belgian, hereafter referred to as me or I, learning to fly an aeroplane. In this week's episode, we'll have a look at how Brexit might affect the future of flying, and you'll get a crash course, not in crashing, but in radio communications. But first, it's time for the blissful 10 seconds where I shut up. So jingle, please.
Level 80.
Flight level 8, there is route 252.
Appearance 31 Golf November, climb flight level 150.
Climbing flight level 150, ready 31 Golf November.
Chances are that you didn't catch too much of this, and that's perfectly normal, unless if you happen to be a qualified pilot, of course, in which case you might want to reconsider your professional occupation. Until a few months ago, all of this would have been quite incomprehensible to my ear as well. What you just heard was a bit of random chatter between air traffic controllers, or ATC, and pilots. In disaster movies, air traffic controllers usually only have one narrative function. They stare at a moving dot on a black and green screen until it disappears, followed by a bit of a dramatic pause where they look out of the tower window in disbelief, take off their headset and utter the phrase, "We've lost the plane." Now, in real life, this is rather unlikely to happen, fortunately, and ATC's main function is to guide planes down safely and simply put make sure there is enough space between planes in the air. And they do that by, indeed, looking at a screen filled with dots which represent all the planes in the air and through communicating instructions with pilots via the radio. As you might have noticed from the audio, these radio connections are in fact still what I would call suboptimal. My very first mobile phone, good old Nokia 3310, provided far superior audio quality to what you've just heard. But this is a reality even around the most modern airports all around the world. The signal relies on some pretty basic technology, and it's very reliable, but it is also very limited in terms of quality. Part of the vocal range gets completely cut off, and interference can sometimes make it difficult to understand each other, especially if you're a recreational pilot like me who's only separated from the noise of his loud piston engine by some thin insulation panels and a flimsy windscreen. As you might recall, in the first few episodes I tried to base as much of my learning on a 1940s guidebook for RAF pilots. Now, that was a plan I had to abandon very quickly, since way too much has changed since then, and probably for the better. But the radio communications, well, they are still pretty similar, and they haven't evolved so much. Of course, there are plenty of additional systems now, but the basics are still in place. Time for a crash course in aviation talk, because pilot's lingo is quite specific, and there are a few rules in place to ensure crystal clear communications and avoid mistakes. Rule number 1. Never say no. Always say negative instead. Yes has a similar alternative. Affirmative, or affirm in short. Alright, that was easy enough. Now, if you get into a bit of a pickle, you should, well, first try to keep calm and fly the plane, and secondly, let the ATC on the ground know that you are in trouble through a radio message. The correct way to do so, repeat after me, pan pan, pan pan, pan pan. So 3 times pan pan. Now, in Spain, you could mistake this for someone in urgent need of bread, because the Spanish word for bread is pan, but in flying life, it signals to the ground that you are in moderate trouble. The only thing worse than pan pan is the dreaded Mayday call, the official distress signal around the world since 1927.
Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Thompson 253 Hotel, engine failure. We are continuing with northwesterly and then inbound towards Wallasey.
Thompson 263 Hotel, roger. All runways available for landing. Surface wind 0, 70 degrees at 5 knots.
This was a Mayday call triggered back in 2013 because of a so-called bird strike right after takeoff. You can imagine our feathered friends don't mix very well with jet engines. I really admire how professional these pilots remained. They even found the time to say good morning when they had to switch frequencies.
Approach, good morning. Mayday, Thompson 263 Hotel, maintaining altitude 3,500 feet, inbound towards Wallasey.
Thompson 263 Hotel, Manchester approach, Roger, Mayday, squawk 7700.
So next time you find yourself on a plane with both pilots unconscious, you know what to do. Grab that headset, report the Mayday, and go down in style. Because there's no way you'll be able to put a 737 on the ground without any training. I've been receiving some requests from listeners to bring in some more talk about what life is like in Spain. I believe this might be to do with my slightly exaggerated rant on Spanish children from episode 5, but I will refrain from slagging off the country or its citizens anymore. It's a lovely place, I quite like Valencia, and it's 21 degrees outside in February. So yeah, come visit, support the local economy, and make Spain great again. If you do visit, there will only be a few minor things that might strike you as a foreigner, other than the insanely unhealthy late dinner times that I've mentioned before. For example, chicken feet in a supermarket, or the obsession with the lottery, anger aimed at politicians, though that might not be an exclusively Spanish thing. Also loud TV programs which lack any sort of coherence or narrative plot. The Spanish people's obsession with different types of paella, nobody cares, or the fact that every single thing gets Spanified, if that's a word. Perhaps Spanificated would be better. Now, I come from a country where we try to at least make half-hearted attempts to use the original term every now and then. Now, that, of course, leads to mix-ups as to the plural of words like scampi or gnocchi, but it really can't get any worse than Tupperware for Tupperware, or Julio Verne for Jules Verne, the most famous 19th century science fiction writer. He was very, very French, so Jules, not Julio. They even spell it with I-O on the book covers. It's unbelievable. Okay, I was getting carried away again. This is not up to my usual standard of pretend professionalism that I'm trying to uphold. So, best to move on to another question that I've received. The other day, somebody asked me, Thomas, how will Brexit impact aviation across the EU and Britain? Now, I didn't want to admit that I didn't really know, so I just gave him the usual, that's an interesting and complicated subject, and it depends. That's usually a deep enough response for a Spanish person because they do it all the time themselves. Now, of course, I immediately started doing some frantic research later that evening, because that's the kind of competitive knob that I am, and my conclusion after 2 hours of reading through draft agreements and legal advice is, nobody really knows what would happen in the case of an abrupt Brexit, but everybody just hopes that it's going to be all right. The final draft agreement that's currently on the table doesn't include anything on air transport, so it's anyone's guess what would happen afterwards. And I think that's all you need to know for now. We'll see what happens. Fingers crossed, and best of luck to Theresa and her friends in Parliament. Now, let's have a vote as to whether this would be a good time to conclude this podcast. Eyes to the right, nose to the left. John?
The eyes to the right, 311. The nose to the left, 293. So the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Unlock!
This will do for episode 6. We have arrived at our destination. As always, questions and comments are most welcome. Also, make sure to subscribe to the Facebook page and to the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you usually get your podcasts from. And share it with your friends, family, housemates, or your pet parrot. For now, goodbye.